Hi, I'm Dr. John. I have a PhD in English literature. I did my thesis on the sonnet sequence genre in England. I've read all of Shakespeare's sonnets and all of the other 55 sonnet sequences published in that period. And what have I learned? Well, today I'm going to give you my 5 top tips for understanding sonnets when we read them. They can seem a little bit complex and knotty, but there's a reason for that. Sonnets consist of a poem that's 14 lines long. Some critics have called them a pressure cooker of feeling or a microcosm of desire. And because of that, they can sometimes read in a concentrated format where complex things are worked out and resolved. That makes it sometimes difficult for us, so I'm going to show you what I've learned about how to read sonnets. So before I get into my 5 tips, a little bit of history. The sonnet came to us from Renaissance Italy. It was made famous by Petrarch. Go forward a couple of hundred years and the sonnet has made it to England. So the very first sonnet sequence that was published in English and in England was a religious verse written by a poet called Anne Locke, a woman, a religious exile who left England because of her puritanical beliefs. She was a follower of Calvin, and appended to some of his translated sermons we find her sonnet sequence. It's called A Meditation upon a Penitent Sinner. That made some impact, but it really didn't become popular until writers like George Gascoigne and Thomas Wyatt, at the time of Henry VIII, published sonnet sequences about love. They become incredibly popular. Then we enter a new phase when Sir Philip Sidney, who made the sonnet incredibly popular in England, published his Astrophil and Stella. That sonnet sequence developed the English style, so that we have a little bit of a departure from the earlier Italian style. In the 1590s, there were dozens and dozens of sonnet sequences published, all trying to catch some of the glory that had been laid there by Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella. Following that boom in sonnet writing, really the first publishing craze in England in the 1590s, we have later poets such as William Shakespeare publishing their sonnets, and they were seeking to do something different to what the poets of the 1590s had done. So we have a new experimental phase of sonnet writing. This is all to say that the sonnet did not have classical precedents. Unlike many other poetic forms, such as the epigram and the ode, they came to us from ancient Greek and Roman sources. The sonnet, however, is a Renaissance invention. So there was some debate as to how the sonnet should properly be used and what topics and subjects it should cover, what it should look like and how it should read. With the first sonnet sequence being published as a religious sonnet and later sonnet sequences being published as love poetry, we have a bit of a debate going on between poets, often within sonnet sequences, as to whether the verse should be used for philosophical, religious and devotional purposes, or whether it should be used to express emotions of human desire, such as love and passion and frustration. So we can often find in love sonnets religious metaphors. Quite often what they're doing is demonstrating how a sonnet sequence can capture both religious devotion and human desire, or how we can make human desire something sacred. It's as if love poets sometimes used religious metaphors and references in order to say, see, I can use sacred language in an erotic love poem. We have a blending of the sacred and the profane. It's a very common thing that we see in sonnet sequences. So the sonnets of Shakespeare came later in the period in which sonnets had become incredibly popular. The sonnet sequences of the 1590s were all published during the reign of Elizabeth I, and quite often we can see poets talking about their beloved woman as if she's a queen, an unobtainable queen, no less, which is quite reminiscent of Elizabeth I. If you remember, she never married, and rejected all of the suitors that were presented to her. Later, we have Shakespeare publishing his sonnets during the first years of the reign of James I. We see some of the metaphors and the language adjusting to fit this new paradigm. James I had a wife, of course, and many children, but he also had male suitors. He had male favourites. In today's language, we would call him bisexual. There was a new way of looking at love and human desire and passion that included male-to-male relationships. And so we find in Shakespeare's sonnets many sonnets that are dedicated to a young man, a male lover. To some extent, we can look at the history around that period in the early reign of James I to explain some of this. Let's look now at my 5 tips for understanding sonnets. Number 1, as I said, because sonnets contain a tension and a conflict, my tip number 1 is to look for the volta. Look for the switch, look for the change from one perspective to the other, or from the problem to the solution. We call this a switch, a change, a flip, but in Italian it was called the volta, so I use that word, the volta, this change from one type of language expressing one type of problem to a type of resolution or a new way of seeing that problem. So if we're looking for the volta, we want to look somewhere about 2/3 down the poem and later. Now, Petrarch perfected this technique of placing the volta exactly after 8 lines of poetry, so that the second third of the poem is resolving or presenting the new perspective. English poets tended to push that volta later and later in the poem. It was part of their poetic bravado to show how daring they could be to push one perspective as long as possible, delaying the volta. Sir Philip Sidney perfected this, and Shakespeare took his example. And so when we talk of a Shakespearean sonnet, we really mean a Sidneyan sonnet. What we find is that the volta, or the change, the shift, comes later in the poem, sometimes in the final couplet and sometimes in the final line. So once we've got the volta, or changing turning point, then we need to look at what is the perspective that's being given to us in the first part or first half of the poem. What is the problem that's being presented, or what is the situation that's being developed? What is the human feeling and emotion, and how is it being explored? Then we want to look at the second part, at the resolution of that problem. What is the solution that's being presented? What is the new perspective that's being shown on human emotion? What is being brought to us that's in opposition to what's already been given? My 4th point is we should look for the imagery that's being used. What metaphors are being used to make the language more persuasive, compelling, and powerful? It could be religious in nature, it could be political. The woman or the lover could be likened to rare jewelry or spices or the sun. Look for that poetic language and try and unpack it and see how does this make the poem more powerful and more persuasive. My last point, the 5th point, is look at the final couplet. Especially in the English sonnet, the final couplet is usually the point. The last 2 lines of the sonnet will give you, usually with great impact, what is actually being driven home. You could have a sonnet that goes for 12 lines, persuasively giving you one perspective, and the whole thing is undone in the final couplet. So when you reread the poem, take special notice of that final couplet. The last 2 lines, they always rhyme together, they come as a pair, and they're normally driving the point home. So just to recap, my 5 points are: look for the volta, the turning point. Look for the perspective in the first part of the sonnet. Look for how that changes and what the change in perspective is. Examine the metaphors and the poetic language to unpack that and see what makes this sonnet persuasive and powerful. And lastly, re-examine the final couplet. So I hope this little video has been helpful to you in reading sonnets. They are really microcosms or mini laboratories of human emotion. And as one critic put it, they are pressure cookers of feeling. If you've enjoyed this content, you'd like to see more, maybe click a like or subscribe. I put videos out about English literature every week. I look forward to seeing you again.